So thank you very much for being here. We're really delighted that Liam Gillick is with us here tonight. Liam doesn't know it himself, but actually I've been hoping that we would have you here for quite some time. We have some mutual friends and I was hoping to be able to use them before to get to you, and so I'm very happy that you are here. I think in the context of our school, it's in a way, I think, quite exciting, quite interesting to have Liam here, because in some ways Liam deals with color, with sights, with relations, with words, with juxtapositions, with light, with movement, with perception, with elements of art. And many of the things that Liam deals with in some ways are very architectural. In a way, they're very design-based, and yet maybe it's not exactly architecture what you're doing, nor is it exactly design, but some of the activities, I think there is a resemblance to what some of the people do in this building. And in as much as there is so much on the kind of the relationship of elements and in terms of rethinking the whole space of exhibition, it seems more and more it's getting to have parallel analogies with architecture, and yet I think it's really productive that it is something very different, and I hope that that will be something that Liam, you will talk about during your lecture. It's also really astonishing the kind of range of collaborations and engagements that Liam has had, and beyond his own sculptures, installations, exhibitions, to be so involved with writing about contemporary art and collaborating with so many people on the topic. Liam's work, as you probably know, has been also exhibited in a number of significant locations and events, including Documented 10 at the Venice, Berlin, and Istanbul Biennial. And he somehow has managed to represent Germany in the 2009 Venice Biennial, despite the fact that he's not German, which is also very interesting that he did that. He's also had solo museum exhibitions at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and at the Tate in London. And over the last 25 years, in terms of his writings, he's contributed to Art Forum, October, Frieze, eFlux Journal, and is the author of a number of books, including a set of essays of his own, and also writing on, in a way, on the history of contemporary art practice, which I suppose one of the key things about it is the degree to which it actually does engage with social-political issues of the day, and the role of the artist as someone who's deeply engaged in conditions of everyday life and is very much participating in those situations. I'm really delighted that Liam is with us tonight, and look forward to hearing your presentation. Please warmly welcome Liam Gillick. Thank
you. Good evening. It's good that you came tonight with the new weather. So what I'm going to do is to try and give you some information, some background about what I've been doing, and to give you a framework for that, and then try and talk about some of the ideas in the book that I published last year, which is a kind of an attempt to look at the history of the contemporary artist as a figure, really, much more than contemporary art as a discipline. It's to look at an attempt to address the question of how do we end up with this figure in society that seems to represent something that's often hard to put your finger on. It's often an implicated figure. It's a person that can be accused of things like being a driver of gentrification in a kind of vague way, right? A purveyor of the, in a sense, a kind of middle-brow kind of nonsense, in a sense. A super self-conscious purveyor of ideas, yet we're not quite sure what those ideas are leading to. A kind of prime hypocrite, in a way, in society that maybe has the same role right now as being a poet might have had in the 1960s, right? A kind of, my parents, they had friends who decided to drive to Australia in a Renault 4 in 1968, and the guy was a poet. And I remember that guy, and he had all the qualities of what we would now think a contemporary artist would be. He clearly had some basis of ideas. He had some consciousness of modernism and the history of poetry. He also was completely deluded about his role in society, in a way, and his importance. He felt he had a connection to something urgent. In that case, it was popular music, rock music. He was also cool in an indefinable way, and felt that time for him was different than time for other people. I'm not saying you can make a direct analogy between these two types of figure, but you can also say that for a contemporary artist, as it were, the same fate potentially stands in front of them as the fate of the poet, kind of the hip poet in the 1960s. So we'll come to that a little bit. So this question of architecture came up at the beginning in the introduction, which is good. And I'm nervous in a way because my kind of weakness is my admiration for architects and people who think hard about planning and building and doing something in the world. But the analogy I gave to Paige earlier about this over the years I've considered, which is, I think art and architecture is like apples and bears, which means that it sounds like you're saying apples and pears, which are related, but it's actually apples and bears. It's a misheard thing. So in fact, there is a great gulf between these disciplines. And over the years, I've thought, and I've been involved in tons of talks about like art and architecture, or art as architecture, or architecture and art. And obviously the idea has been to encourage this idea there should be a melding of these things, or a kind of crossover. And over the years, I've thought more and more there shouldn't be a crossover. There should be more difference and more discrimination, in a sense, between different practices. And in a way, what therefore has happened in my work over the years is I've come very close to things. And it's very different, coming close to something, having proximity in the sense that Agamben would talk about proximity, for example. It's very different from collaborating or merging or being together. So I try to get to the point and show you some images. And it's always a scary one to show because you start to think, oh God, if he's showing this, we'll be going through this like year by year. But this is the first and last painting. This is from 1987. It tells you something. It's a portrait of Adi Dassler. And Adi and his brother Rudi were sports shoe manufacturers in Germany. One founded Puma and one founded Adidas. And this was the sort of work I was doing as I left college, which was greeted with a resounding 2-1, if anyone knows what that means in British terms. And it's a tea tray. And in Walden 2 by B.F. Skinner, you notice the mentioning of tea trays, better tea trays. So I leave art school, and then this is the first exhibition in 1989, and that was very important for me. I thought maybe one day it would be good to be able to say I was an 80s artist. So in 1989, I was running out of time. And I had a chance to do an exhibition, and I jumped at it. And it was in December 1989, and I had no money and no materials, but I had a Mac SE30 and a printer. So what I'd been doing through that year was every day I would work on a parallel activity. In this case, I was working on the facades of buildings. And I'd use the first drawing program on an Apple to design facades of buildings. And I'd do maybe 80 a day or 100 a day. And in the exhibition, I made 84 of them. And we handed them out at the opening. And people would look at them. And then they could buy them in boxes like that. This is jumping. Thankfully, there are these big jumps to a little bit later. This is a room in an exhibition in Frankfurt in 1999. And I decided to give over one room in the exhibition as a space for a conference on criticism. And so you can see again another of this kind of parallel. It's like working in parallel. And the room was used for 3 days to talk about, of course, the word that goes very well with criticism, which is crisis. The crisis of criticism, especially in Germany. And it has a joke by Matthew Modine about Steven Spielberg and Stanley Kubrick on the wall, to remind the people while they're having their conference on the crisis of criticism, maybe about, I don't know, death, for example, because it's about, it's an old joke that works with other people. It would work very well with architects, of course. It's a joke, you know, that Steven Spielberg dies and goes to heaven, and St. Peter meets him at the gates and says, you know, we love your films, you're great. If there's anything you need, just ask us. And he says, well, I always wanted to meet Stanley Kubrick. And they say, you know, Stanley doesn't do meetings, you know that, and but we'll see what we can do. And it keeps going on, and he never gets to meet Stanley Kubrick. And finally, one day, he sees this old guy with a beard riding around on a bicycle in an old army jacket, and he says, hey, look, that's him, that's Stanley Kubrick. And of course, the punchline, which is the old joke, is that's not Stanley Kubrick, that's God. He just thinks he's Stanley Kubrick. So it was good to have that joke there for 3 days, because you really starts to be irritating, but it did have some effect on the discussion. Materials. Dyed jute, or Hessian, they call it in England, and chipboard, and vinyl. Again, showing this kind of weak materials. This is a prototype manuscript for a book I wrote in around that time called Erasmus is Late, which is about a meeting of secondary individuals over time. This is a hole outside the Porticus in Frankfurt that I dug with another artist called Angela Bullock, that was during an exhibition about football and karaoke. So we decided we would take a pre-football, prior karaoke position and instead consider ourselves medieval. So we did a project called We Are Medieval, which involved digging a kind of pig hunting hole outside the Porticus and sitting in it and not entering the museum at all. So again, you have this parallelism, but in this case, a sense of not wanting to be included, a kind of Bertrand Russell-esque sense of not wanting to be in the set of all the artists who are obviously into karaoke and football in the 90s. Another similar type thing that shows itself in a slightly different way, which is a clock. What I guess, I don't know, in Germany, I think we were calling it Lampentechnik or something, you know, where you have light bulbs. And the clock in this case is flicking in time between 1810 and 1997, and it's telling you it's telling you local time before railways introduced a kind of universal time, as it were, and the time in 1810. So of course it's wrong in terms of the railway and then right in terms of the railway. So you have this flickering with time without using time-based media. So what you can see with these things is a kind of integration in a way, like a response to conditions, a certain lightness of touch, the use of just a big ream of paper with some printing on it. things being prototypes or parallel, not actually having a primary way of existing. And around this time, I started to produce more recognizably abstract sculptures. And here we see some in probably the early 2000s in London. And you see this statement in the background: the commune itself becomes a super state. So one of the things that was alluded to in the introduction is this sense of the relationship between the individual and the group, which is always a complicated one in terms of art history and art practice. The fact, for example, that at an art school like the one I went to, you couldn't work in a group very easily. All the crits or the assessments were based on your individual practice, on your individual work. Yet, through this period when you're seeing, and I'm doing it myself, these individual works, they're always done in a context. There's always other artists around, there's a museum around, and importantly, there are curators around. So what I started to do by making these works is what I now understand is a kind of schizophrenic practice, but that's a misuse of the word schizophrenic. I think it's more and excuse anyone here who has issues like this. It's hard to make allusions to things without using certain terminology. Let's say an unreconcilable rift in the work between a kind of formalist, you could say, or abstract practice on one hand, and some of the other things I was showing you. Right? So these I've worked on for the last 20 years, and they're, in a way, a more precisely abstract secondary function. They're screens, false ceilings, wall panels, small freestanding screens. I call them fins. And these things which are, what the hell do I call them? Elevations. So this is where it gets kind of complicated. And here we can see some people enjoying some platforms and benches. So what's going on? There seems to be this kind of unresolvable problem between these small gestures, these collaborations, these moments of delicacy sometimes, and these clearly built, constructed, fabricated things. The thing is, the titles of these works always give something away. That some of the overhead platforms, I always called them, well, first platforms rather than false ceilings, discussion platform, but also maybe development platform or revision platform or deviation screen or conciliation screen. Basically, the wording and the vocabulary from, in a sense, the things that became concrete politically under Clinton and Blair, and especially the aesthetics and the attitude towards cultural policy that came out, especially under people like Tony Blair and the third wave politicians. And there's a whole body of my work that happens both delicately and very precisely, that plays with the coding of renovation, compromise, rejuvenation, cladding, secondary components. And if you could say that Carl Andre's work, right, and he's written and talked about this, the use of plates on the ground doing what plates do, or logs, lumps of wood doing what wood does, come from the influence of being around the rail yards in Quincy, right? My work comes from being around that moment, being in that moment, being in my early 30s during that moment, and trying to develop a language that was appropriate to my time, that would be critically conscious of the conditions of production that were around me. And here we see a quarter-scale model of a public project for a plaza in Guadalajara. And here we see what happened quite quickly is people would say, okay, you seem to think about these things, so maybe you can help us with our problem. This is the Interior Ministry or Home Office in London, a project from 2002 to 2005, when I was brought in to a public-private partnership which had all the accompanying ideas that you have to spend 1% on the art budget. But there was a crisis within the architecture of the building, which is a Terry Farrell building. He's not a very fashionable architect, but is actually kind of an interesting person. So I basically worked on all aspects of the facade of this building and introduced some of the things I'd been playing with the other work, kind of to emphasize these things. Here we see a shot of the front and a treatment of the facade, which was in order to stop them putting those logos that they put on government buildings with a kind of swoopy thing, or to rebrand it, to make it very hard to rebrand and remark the building. And you can see, where's Malaysia? Here, this is the sign for the building. It says the Home Office, and there's another one up here. And then this thing, these are designated as artworks within the collection of the government art collection. So to have them removed is very, very difficult. So when different governments come and go in Britain, when the Conservatives came in a few years ago, they really wanted to put a great big kind of big shield thing with like rampant lions or maybe a swoopy thing going to the right and up to the right. But they can't do it without getting a special order to remove the artwork. And as I was joking earlier, though, probably the most important part of the project for me was being in the conversation, in the discussion, in the room. And it was the use of the color RAL 9035 for the building, where I would often find myself in meetings with quite serious people. And finally, someone turned to me and said, well, what color should it be? And I knew it should be RAL 9035, which is the kind of thing that only an artist can sometimes say in those situations. I didn't have to prove it or show it or do a series of studies. I could just say it. It's a very different thing. It's apples and bears, right? This is the facade of the Fairmont Hotel in Vancouver. And it has a work on it that probably explains things the best, which is stainless steel lettering that says, lying on top of a building, the clouds look no nearer than they had when I was lying on the street, which in a way is an extraordinary gesture of Canadian sophistication. or duplicity, to allow this comment to go on the building that critiques the building and yet makes the building cool at the same time. This is a building in Guadalajara in Mexico that I worked with an architect called Rodrigo Gonzalez Villaseñor. And it looks like we kind of just knocked it up in a few days, and that's sort of what we did. So in that case, most of this work, again, seen as artwork and art commission and not architecture, including what you could imagine, this kind of stuff, but not the carpet and not this. But these things, I would go on the site as an artist, right, with a studio of people that came, who were often the same people who were building the building, except nominally now they were making art, so they were paid differently and acted differently and spoke differently, even though they were doing the same thing that they'd been doing earlier. And we would basically, I would draw on my computer, we'd output some things, we'd blow them up, and then we basically weld things together and put them together on site. And I'd come and have a look. It was an extraordinarily free way to work and highly unusual, and outside most of the parameters of the building, planning and coding for the building. But anyway, this is a model. This comes to Venice now. I'll show you a few photos of the Venice Biennale. Try not to get into it too much, but I got invited as that 90s person that I mentioned earlier, the one who thought hard about third way post-wall conditions and aesthetics, and also as a sacrifice in a way, because you get brutalized doing the German pavilion. I mean, that's the way it should be. It should have a critical culture and a critical environment. In this case, what I did is I moved my rather elliptical and secondary thinking one step across. So the abstraction became more precise and more referential, and the voice became more singular and less general. So I started by raising money for the project by making a model of the unbuilt German pavilion from the 1950s that would have completely erased, in a sense, the Nazi renovation of the original Bavarian pavilion. I then worked on the great unit, which you all probably know and all probably should be working with, which is the kitchen cabinet, which is 60 centimeters by 60 by whatever, 75, varying heights. And I spent a lot of time sitting in the Frankfurter kitchen in the Mack in Vienna that was made by the great architecturin Greta Schutte-Lehotzky. And as a tribute to her attempt to make a better life for people and to have a good 20th century as a German, I put bug blinds in the doorway of the German pavilion to attempt to domesticate and denazify this building. And a kitchen inside, a kind of a cheap kitchen, but an ideal kitchen in a sense. The unit that's common, that you can find in Ramallah or Bolivia, or the Seamatic store in downtown Cambridge, if there is a downtown here. And then on the top of the cabinets, I put a cat. And the cat is obviously dead. The cat speaks. And the cat tells a story about a speaking cat. The cat as the kitchen cat, the cat who survives everything, and the cat who sees everything and experiences every trauma and tiptoes through rubble, for example. And the cat is sad one day because you know what? You can find the story online, but I had a lot of fun doing this, and I have to say, no good deed goes unpunished in Germany. So of course, I did feel like you probably feel sometimes completely misunderstood for the first time in my life, and I only have myself to blame for that. So there you go. The one good thing, I don't know if anyone's familiar with the TV program Sabrina the Teenage Witch, but I am a big artist, like many of you probably at some point, go through big phases. Well, it's pre-internet really, so watching daytime TV. So I was a big fan of Clarissa Tells It All and Sabrina the Teenage Witch and Charmed, because they were always on in the morning. And of course, there's a speaking cat in Sabrina the Teenage Witch. So I always wanted to work with a wise, wry, ironic speaking cat. But the night before the opening, I realized that this cat telling the story about a speaking cat going in this circular, self-loathing story, having been accused of stealing people's breath while they sleep, turning back on the humans, turning back on people and reminding them that it's they that steal people's breath. It's they that take away joy. It's they that destroy everything. I took the gallery guide, which is this thing. It's here. It's the gallery guide, right? It's the thing with the little bit of information saying that I did documenter and I did a show here and a show there. And I screwed it up into a bow type shape. And I jammed the mechanism of the cat by stuffing it in its mouth, but it still was trying to move like Westworld. It was still kind of... So I got a long nail and waited till everyone had gone. This is the night before the opening, and got the nail and stuffed it through the piece of paper into the cat's mouth, which finally jammed the mechanism. And then I remember walking away from the building as fast as possible, thinking, I've just done the most evil thing in history. So I can't really say more than that. It's just, there are these moments, and I'm sure you have them, where you realize you may have done something bad without, and it's to do with it's to do with a weird combination of aesthetics, gestures, references, and implications. Collaborative work with Lawrence Weiner for a museum in Antwerp, which involved making an entire floor, working with Forbo, no other things, no other signage, nothing. This is a big project. I want to bring you to this collaborative thing quickly. In Arles, in France, a show that I put together with Philippe Perreno called To the Moon via the Beach, where we imported 150 lorry loads of sand to the Roman arena, and that's the final state of the moon. But basically we based this principle on the idea that it's always more interesting to watch other people working than do it yourself. So we had these sand geniuses from Holland come and work all day, transforming the sand from a beachscape to a moonscape and never stopping working. And while they were doing this, other artists intervened and did things around it. Again, this secondary thing, this parallelism. Here's work by Elvire Bonduel, young French artist who made these lunar material, aircraft, space material umbrellas. This work by Dominique Gonzalez-Förster that I didn't understand. Work by Lawrence Weiner, who kept saying that, the thing, I don't know if anyone's come across him, but he's worth looking into if you haven't, who kept saying it's all about washers, like everything's about, the whole world is held together by washers, you know what I mean? The things between a nut and a bolt. And that's what you need to think about in the world is washers. So he made some, and then we had a spaceman who'd walk around playing a harmonica, and you see them working. And this is the work that was the most notable there by Pierre Huyghe, where he paid an actor to wear a rubber mask that is an exact copy of his head. And then bees would hive on his head every day, and the man would walk out blinded by this into the center of the arena until he fell to the ground or fell to his knees. And then quickly the last few slides, just to show that a certain kind of, that within all these practices, if you could say that there are these things, right? There's collaboration at one level, there's a certain kind of commitment to a kind of abstraction on another, a desire to express something that's hard to express through form, a kind of muted form, and then there's a kind of delicate interventions and so on. There are also these moments of contradiction that come out of other things, and that's what I wanted to show you at the end. So this is a one-year show I did last year at the Museus Serralves in Porto, and it's a Caesar building, Alvaro Caesar building from the 90s, I think, or the 80s. Kind of a great building, and they've restored it. It'd gotten tatty, because as buildings get, they're Southern European buildings, they start to look kind of ratty around the edges quite quickly, but they fixed it up again. And I did a show there of these works that are kind of can't be accounted for in my normal narrative. So this is a piano that plays Grandolo Villa Morena, which was the song that was played to signal the start of the Portuguese Revolution in '74. Meanwhile, black snow falls. And it's me trying to remember the music, trying to remember how the song goes. It's a very melancholic, evocative work. But it comes from me saying to Philippe Perreno years ago, when we didn't have ideas, right? And in film school, you could always say, if you have no ideas, there's always Tarkovsky, right? In architecture school, you could say, well, there's always, years ago maybe, or even now, you could say, well, there's always Corbusier, right? There's always something to fall back on, if in doubt, to acquire taste and resonance and meaning and significance and even grand ambition. With us, we realized maybe it's a piano in black snow. This would carry enough in the art context. Here's my first proposed artwork, which brings me, I'm trying to get to the end of my explaining everything. The trick to this apples and bears thing is don't build a building. Never try and build a building. Artists who build buildings are great. And artists who build their own houses are great, but artists who build other buildings for other people, I don't think are that great. And I've never, in fact, they can't do it. It's not possible. It's psychologically, philosophically, and conceptually incoherent. Doesn't make any sense. So this is a building that I proposed in 1992 for the city of Milan for a new public housing project where they wanted an abstract public artwork. And I realized they didn't. What they needed was a center for young people. And already at the age of 28, I was feeling not that urgently young. So I figured what I would do is I'd propose them in a center for young people. There would be a free zone where no one can go in it apart from young people. And I would seed this building with the two contradictory, libidinous urges of the male psyche, which is AC/DC and Joy Division. The kind of crotch-thrusting idiocy of AC/DC and the shoegazing seriousness of Joy Division. And by doing that, set up an immediate argument that could be overwritten and overscored. They weren't interested. They were so uninterested, they didn't even reply. They didn't even respond. It just got dropped completely. From that point on, I never proposed or built or attempted to even think about a building ever again, which has been very, very good for me. And that's a model of it, and here's a kind of phantom model of it, combining these two contradictions, which I think is rather beautiful in its own way. And here is a work which is a large version of Guy Debord, towards the end of his life, decided to mainly work on war games. And so this is a large version of a war game that similar to one that he designed. Just to show you how this play with form and touch and lightness and collaboration has developed. And then my last show just now in Berlin, which is modeled on the apartment I used to stay in Vienna from memory, which is this great street, one of the greatest named streets in the world, which is called Stoßen Himmel, which means kind of hit the sky or punch heaven or touch heaven in a way, firmly, touch heaven firmly. So I did this, and it's basically my graphic work, which I've, I know it's an important part of what architecture students do and art students, but I realized I'd produced a lot of graphics and a lot of secondary work, which a bit like the sign on a building, right? The signage that tells you the name of the building. It's like that direct engagement moment, right? Which I realized I told more stories through the secondary or third level or fourth level or fifth level minor gesture than I ever did through a collaboration or the work or whatnot. And that's the last image of that, which is sort of the end of part 1.5, because I'm going to develop this a bit, but not for too long. But I'll just show you this to give you an idea, right? So we've seen these various things. And I think this is always the thing to look out for yourself, because you realize that so a magazine cover saying, were people this dumb before TV? A print for a Belgian guy that says tobacco, it's like a tobacco factory. Different states of a public artwork for Utrecht. A poster that I did for a magazine, a series of posters I did for a magazine in the Netherlands. Another one here, Dear Editor. I kind of like this one. A kind of plea, a poster for a film that I made about, a very short 1.5-minute film I made about the former Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara. A design for a taxi I did in Vienna that you can use as a ruler or a measuring device, because it's broken down into 10-centimeter things. And this Mercedes used to drive around Vienna as a taxi, and you could use it to measure buildings with. A public poster I did anonymously in Paris that got put up all over the canal on the way to Villette. A print about speculation and planning that you will find very useful, any of you who think about planning, because it just is states of speculation and planning in percentile shifts with no logical change. So you get the idea. Design for a billboard, right? A design for the Vietnam Saigon Biennale in maybe 2000. So you start to get a much bigger picture from here. Okay. So, what we see seems to show a lack of direction, and I would argue that's exactly right. There is very little direction. Things do not lead easily from one to the other. There's some self-consciousness in all this work. There's some things are derived from, but not a lot. A lot of it's to do with play. It's to do with suburban upbringing and whatnot. There's very little citation in the work of other things, right? There's a lot of response, call and response. The artist is a useful person that can provide these things that cannot be quite touched, or you can't quite put your finger on. What it is this quality of being in the world that isn't quite, you can't quite do it in other things. So coming back to the Home Office building, this ability to play with the facade and designate that as an artwork changes the relationship and the way the architect can work in relation to the client and the city and designation in a different way. But it's a very soft, subtle thing. What I noticed, though, in the last few years is something that's always been there, which is an increasing rupture in the art context. An increasing rupture between the people who are interested, in a sense, in context, in organization, in art as a kind of place within which to do, in which to agitate at one level, but also in which to come up with a replacement for what they strongly to believe is a failure on the part of architects, planners, urbanists, especially politicians more so, to actually provide human spaces that are not just smoothly glossed over by a neoliberal kind of wash of like some nice landscaping and some gentrification. So you have quite profoundly agitating structures in the art world, which are very in parallel to the agitating ones within the edge of architecture and planning. They often cross over. You get the same theorists talking to both sets of people. But this clearly creates a rupture. And those people are often completely against or uninterested in anything that could pass for a discrete art object, right? The historical art object, the late modern art object. In the same way that you have architects and architectural theorists who would say we are completely disinterested in anything that constitutes a built practice. And these discussions, of course, were circling around the AA and places like that, you know, before, when I was in my, I was just an idea. So what's happened is there's a kind of strange convergence at one level of an attempt to be outside, right? And at the same time, a kind of increase in the idea with the rise of contemporary art history as a discipline, a rise in the idea that you can talk about there having been an origin of contemporary art. This is the reason I wrote the book, Industry and Intelligence, because I wanted to look at this rupture, like this schism, which in art has become as deep as the Reformation or something. It's as extreme. There are people that I know I've worked with for nearly 20 years now who would never, ever set foot in a private gallery or the Tate Gallery or the Museum of Modern Art because it is not a repository of anything they recognize as interesting or as art. Okay, they might sneak in to the last day of an Isa Genskin show or a Sigmar Polka show, but generally speaking, they steer clear of these places completely. On the other hand, you can get a very elevated, almost in a Lukácsian sense, kind of formalist way that you can find exemplified around some press releases now, right? So you could talk about a young painter dude, right? And he's doing his paintings, which look like a kind of race to the bottom to see who can do the most slack painting. And the press release will say something like, let's call him Josh Vanderbilt. Josh Vanderbilt interrogates his own subjectivity while probing at historical modes of painting as a form. And this is great. I mean, I agree, this is a very sophisticated practice probably, but it's a very particular one, right? And it's very much signals things. It signals a certain kind of affiliation or set of connections or desires. So what you've got right now is something that's happened over the years at different moments in architecture and various other fields, but just at different times. It just happens to be happening right now. So what I wanted to, however, what happens, because contemporary art's the longest, I'm kind of going to wind this up really, because we can talk about it in a more conversational way. However far you try and step outside, unlike architecture, where I think there were moments where you could step outside and say, I'm now a theorist, or I'm a paper architect, or I'm not even an architect, I think about human relations, or I don't know what I am, I'm just another type of human being. The art world, because its very particular relationship to capitalism and its particular relationship to exchange, tends to be able to absorb what tries to step outside it. So, a good example, and I have to go backwards because, like, this is what happens because I'm not a specialist. Okay, it's clear that certain attempts to step outside the current discourse in architecture are partly the nature of architecture itself. That's partly what one is studying. At the same time, while things do leak into the kind of the built mainstream, it happens through certain figures or through certain people carrying that, or it leaks in and kind of secretes itself. What happens in the art world, to a certain extent, is these contradictory or broken kind of sides can all be absorbed within the art world, within the art context, within the art market even. So however hard you try and step outside, you can be absorbed within it. And this is it's quite close to what we all think about art historically, but it's particularly strong now. So I tried to write a book about what are the technical and genealogical and historical political reasons why we have this thing called contemporary art, which has been the longest lasting, in a sense, if you exclude like a phrase like the Renaissance, which obviously is kind of idiotic to think. I'm talking about art post 1900. Contemporary art's lasted the longest because it's the one thing that's not a no one calls themselves a contemporary artist anymore. I'm not sure anyone says contemporary architect either, but it's a description of a kind of thing that you kind of know what it is. You can smell it and taste it, but it's not a movement. It's a kind of temporal descriptor that will do to encompass anything. It's an amoebic thing that can keep growing and absorbing things. And I wanted to look at what were the historical technical conditions that allowed that to happen. How did that happen? Even in the face of Adorno, even in the face of, or maybe he's the fault in fact, but in the face of robust criticism, robust self-consciousness, how does that happen? So just to, because I think if people have questions, we could do that. So just give you a quick indication of some of the chapter headings, because it tells you, it sums up everything, and then we could have questions. So contemporary art does not account for that which is taking place. This is very true. I spend a lot of my time with people who don't make any work, they'd rather be shot, they'd rather have their face eaten by weasels than make anything resembling anything. But not only that, they don't consider hanging around and having tea or doing nothing to be doing work either. They are outside. There's a new community of critical consciousness that uses a kind of art umbrella under which to operate. It's a kind of useful umbrella. So contemporary art does not account for that which is taking place. Projection and parallelism, these are the two things that the most profound things, in my opinion, that allow contemporary art to retain this kind of strange position. It projects towards something. It's constantly heading for something just out of reach, and it's inherently parallel. It's always in parallel. I can never get blamed for the sins of an architect because I work in parallel to them. I never am taking on their responsibilities. Then I dealt with 4 specific dates that I won't go into detail about because it's too long. But there's also something temporal here about ASAP future, not infinite future. So art became more and more closer to the present, like the way developed capitalism became better and better at capitalizing on the recent past and the near future. Art also came closer and closer to the present. It was one of the things that could do that. Abstract, you have to talk about the endurance of the idea of a kind of abstraction as a marker for art. The Complete Curator, which is a text I wrote, which is in the book, about the idea of the curator as a figure, and this should never be underestimated. Every time you see a dopey book or a stupid article or a thing online about curating yourself, or even Hans Urich's book about curating, it's hard to underestimate what the complete curator means and how it changed everything. The arrival of the curatorial voice, or their demands, the ethical demands of advanced curators now run so far in advance of art itself that it's impossible for any artist to possibly keep up with that demand, right? So you get, all you have to do is study, for example, The Last Documenta to find an example of that. The return of the border, which of course in art is very important. A good example is Willem de Kooning came to America whenever, 1946 or something, and is thought of as an American painter within about 18 months, as far as I can make out. I moved here 20 years ago, and I'm quite rightly a British, in a way, British and with a bit of Irish thrown in, artist. Now, that's very important because it's important, because for many people it's important to know where you came from and who you are and where you stand, right? So, and the world worked very well for male artists in America at that point in the late 40s. So, of course, de Kooning became one of the guys. He became an American artist. And he stated that he was an American artist with his heavy Dutch accent. I'm doomed. I will never be an American artist, like I'm not a German artist. That's why I could do the German Pavilion, because I'm not one. And I can't be one. I'm kind of stuck. But the return of the border, ironically, is an issue that we can all discuss. Okay, the last 3 are the experimental factory. The idea that art can give us experimental models is, in a way, or the gap between the idea that contemporary art can give us an experimental or living model of practice and the reality of art is actually a withdrawn, melancholic and self-loathing practice is what's really interesting to me. That's what I look at in that chapter. Nostalgia for the group, the relationship between the individual and the group. This is something I came to the IMP opening night on Thursday, which was ostensibly about management and models of work and how partnerships and things are done. What you find is that this is very coherent and stated. It's structurally part of architectural practice. Within art, all interesting moments start as a group, right? Because you're a bunch of undefinable people of a generation, maybe from a place. They then become more refined and more discriminating and more broken down. And then when things return or become interesting again, such as the pictures generation in New York, it starts to become a group again. Now, this also happens in other fields like literature, architecture, and music. It was particularly strong in contemporary art, this idea of nostalgia for the group. And it's partly to do with curatorial and critical approaches, because it becomes interesting if you start to understand the group, again, the nostalgia for the group. You can return to the group and find the people that were excluded from the group. And this, I look at also in the book. And finally, final chapter is called Why Work, which is really a question it's really a section trying to address the accusation that artists are the ultimate freelance knowledge workers, that they are really the guilty ones, that they're the ones that have been responsible for creating a model of existence that has dragged us into this kind of relativistic, renovated kind of nowhere, dystopia, the cappuccinoization of all moments of life. And I kind of refute this. I dismiss this accusation in a sense, but I do it as a matter of principle rather than really being able to do it. But I think you'd have to read Pierre Bourdieu to really get further than that on that one. I think it's already been covered in a way. So, I would ask if there are any questions, and it's always a tricky one. I don't know if you want to come and help mediate that.
So Liam, thank you very much. Really, you've left us with a lot of questions, a lot of issues. I know there are quite a few people who would like to, or I hope that they will engage you in conversation. Just to push you a little bit about sort of apples and bears. Because I think, I mean, maybe this is very unfair, but I mean, on one level, you're the artist, you're the curator, you're the critic, and you kind of do all of those things simultaneously. I suppose part of it in terms of the book is to ask to what end, in the sense, what's the purpose of the book? To construct a new artist, to develop a criticism of contemporary art, so what is the relationship between the production of the book and really the status of the artist and how it helps you? So one question relates to that, but more specifically on this apples and bears. I mean, I feel like, okay, when you are doing pieces that resemble certain kinds of design activity, assembly of things, color juxtaposition of things, installation of elements that could be at once thought to be the model of something, but yet they're not. That's fine. But when you start collaborating with Terry Farrell and you make part of a facade of a building, and you then say, well, I'm the bear, or I'm the apple, whatever. But I mean, I think my question to you is that at that moment, there is a level of complicity in the work where you can no longer claim to be the artist so independently, even though it may be that from the perspective of the UK government's designation of the difference between architecture and art, the piece can be protected. But to a passerby who is assessing and perceiving that building, that could also easily be seen as ornament, for example. And so I'm just trying to figure out how you can participate to that degree in the fabrication of a piece of architecture and at the same time claim a kind of innocence, which you try to do to some degree. So.
It's a good question, but it cuts to the heart of what I try and get to in the book, which is none of these things are a problem for me, in a sense. When you said, well, it can become like ornament, for example, it can become like a sort of, maybe even you could go further and say a kind of attractive design solution that sort of gets around the problem of a slightly clumsily executed attempt to do a kind of a certain form of a certain kind of aesthetic that we can recognize in that building with the louvers and the different components, the different forms. And I would say, yes, they're exactly the things. And the two ways I would look at it, especially as a student, I was still taught, and this is where it comes down to, some of these differences are about teaching. We still had legacy Greenberg teachers, meaning a few grumpy men who were abstract painters, and they believed in muscular painting, whatever that meant. And they believed in the idea of truth to materials, truthiness in the way of like addressing in a muscular way the push and pull of the painting or something. And this for them was kind of outside the concerns of everyone else, and outside the mess of life. And it did, of course, create extraordinary moments in art. It was also funded by the CIA, a lot of it, and especially the talking about it and the showing of it. And it was also very male, in a very straight male way, and with some exceptions, good exceptions, like Grace Hartigan and other artists who were very good and interesting. The point is that they used what struck me in the mid-80s as very gendered accusations. So if I was very interested in, like if we go, well, we won't. The first thing, the tea tray with the colors on it, which now suddenly makes sense, the portrait of Adi Dassler, I was told this was designy and decorative by one of these grumpy old men who then just stalked off to go to the pub. And I thought, yes, it is. And it's deliberately so. And I wanted to be involved in this world of, in a sense, lures, using things as lures and using things as secondary things. Mainly what happens in that home office building is I replace materials. This is a very kind of postmodern thing to do. I look at what we can do with the glazing, and I go to the factory in Troyes in France, to Saint-Gobain or whatever, and see if I can talk them into doing a fritting on the glass for the same price as just making the glass. So I use what artists are really good at, which is being just you with another person or a few people, and trying to talk them into doing something or try to get something done. So it's all about role-playing. Yes, I agree with you. It's about role-playing. It's about complicity. Everything for me is about implication. I wrote a text once called the Implicated Player, which is about this idea of the artist as the implicated figure. And that's really what a lot of the book's about, is about the history of how do we get to this point. Well, it's because we have the right conditions in society to produce this kind of figure of the contemporary artist, who is, in a sense, this implicated player. And it won't be like that forever, but it's like it for a brief while. They represent something. But part of that comes through technology and through the apparatus, as much as it comes through theory and Adorno and the rise of Western Marxism and the desire to be in a subcultural frame and things like that. None of those things are enough to explain why we have these odd figures around who are supposed to fulfill certain roles.
So maybe other people will come in, but I mean, that's why I wanted to mention the book and the role of writing and criticism, because in some ways, I'm wondering what your reaction is to the fact that, in some sense, then I could say, again, maybe this is not fair, that why are you so insistent in controlling the reading of the work? Because by being both the artist and the critic simultaneously, in some way, there is a sense that the reception of the work is also something that you seem quite intent in being part of. And so, like, what is the role of the person who is not so familiar with the work? Because part of your work relies on a kind of knowing. And it seems like nobody knows it as well as you do to some degree. So
right.
That bit is sort of like, I'm curious about that.
But we have
involvement.
But we have other artists in the room here who I'd always been a fan of, who've also written and have a tradition of writing. And I was always drawn to artists who try and either make an account of themselves or the conditions under which they attempt to produce work. And I tried to do my version of that for a period which is now increasingly under scrutiny, certainly in academic writing, in sociology primarily, which is around the formation of the period in the 90s and the rise of the new third way, the collapse of social democracy in a way in Europe, which is now leading that collapse via the rise of the third wave, Tony Blair, and a new kind of attitude towards the role of culture in society and what it should do, access, engagement. What are the other words? Because this is our time, right? These good things and how they affected an understanding of the role of art and culture in society. A lot of my work is deeply embedded. This is a better type of tea tray that is a picture of someone who ended up making shoes that you wear to signify how much leisure you're having and how specialized the leisure it is that you're having. And this is from 1987, right? So you've got to think, what else is being made in 1987? And certainly around in England, no one's making a portrait of Adi Dassler, which is a kind of corrupted Mondrian done in kind of contemporary sportswear colors on a tea tray. So my writing is not necessarily, I'm not trying to write about my own work. I'm often writing about other artists, as Stephen's done and other people in the room have done. In my book, I'm trying to write an account of my, what I see, right?
So, any? Please, there's the mic that I think is going to come to you soon.
Hi. Hi.
Okay.
Maybe a very silly question, but I just wonder, why are you feeling the counters of the typefaces every now and then?
Yes. I don't know if anyone's familiar with an open source software called Blender. And Blender is often a gateway 3D software for people who don't have money and they don't have access to art school or architecture school facilities. And it's actually kind of interesting, Blender, because it's like a lot of open source software. It's a little tricky, the interface. It's a bit like, I mean, they all are, right? But you don't get, it's a hard one. But I've used Blender now on and off for years because it keeps getting improved, like all open source software. And once you work out the kinks in it, you can get things done in it that you can't quite do in CAD and in the other ones that are more proprietary. It also doesn't catastrophically update itself in ways that become annoying. It sort of just gradually changes. So there's two reasons. It's hard for me to give short answers, but the first reason is if you grew up in the 1970s before the internet and when there was only 3 channels on TV and most of them weren't on most of the time, I spent a lot of time in the kitchen filling in the D's and the A's and the O's in my dad's newspaper because I was so bored in the suburbs that I just remember doing that a lot. And I did it in books, whole books, that I would do that too. And on the other hand, Blender, when I would start to work with Blender, was very bad. When you turned a typeface into a mesh, it would tend to fill in and extrude it a little bit. It would tend to fill them in. And it was an incredible pain in the ass to get rid of them all by triangulating the mesh and trying to pick them all out one by one. So I decided instead of fixing the problem, which is a very particular way of doing it, I thought I would instead in a font building program, make my own version of Helvetica that had some filled in characters, and you could also randomize it. And so that's the answer. So it's this kind of classic combination.
Hello. I was kind of interested in what you're talking about in terms of implications and being complicit. And I mean, you talk about your work as very contextual. Like, it's always like, okay, what was happening in 1987 or what was happening then? And you kind of try to capture that instant. And I would say that, like, architects and designers also draw upon these sort of cultural implications and try to bring that into their work. And it's like, I guess I'm wondering, like, how do you shape your work based off of these contextual these cultural contexts and things like that.
Right. No, I agree. I don't really do research. I found there was a point when art became more serious, and some people in the room would have recognized this too, where you'd arrive somewhere to do something, to do an exhibition or to make some work, and people would say, "Oh, are you here researching?" And you'd think, "Where did this word suddenly come from? Why am I'm just in Milan." and I will be making an exhibition of what I want to make. I'm not researching. But what's happened is partly it's slightly the Wikipediaization of things, in the sense that things have to have a paper trail, right? You have to be able to prove that they, to a certain extent, more and more. There's a lot of highly interesting artists where you need to be able to work out where it comes from. It leaves a paper trail, right? As if there's a simple rift in art between a kind of Dionysian figure on one hand who randomly just kind of does this, and then the people who've double-checked everything. In fact, life's much more complicated, and art's more complicated than that. All I would say about what you were asking is that I'm not researching, right? So I'm not going to look at the way that tower, the terrible tragedy of that tower, the Grenfell Tower in England. That's right. I know that area really well. And I remember them doing that kind of thing. My work, a lot of it, refers to this process of manic renovation and cladding that started to take place in the 80s and 90s and onwards, that attempted to give a new kind of sheen to these brutalist buildings and these apparently failed buildings. That instead of knocking them down, you could rebrand them with aesthetics, right? A certain aesthetic. And it was done, of course, with a what do you call it, like a sprinkling of ecological consciousness, because it was also supposed to make them better buildings. They would now be warmer, more insulated. I think they were probably done with good intentions. So what I'm trying to say is that when I mentioned Carl Andre claims his minimalist art from the 60s is influenced by seeing the truth of materials sitting as they fell or were laid down on the ground in the rail yards of Quincy. My work is made under conditions of having emerged at a period when people were cladding things, rebranding them. Arthur Anderson and co. Accountants becomes like Utravia or Altria or something. Everything, well, what Altria is Philip Morris, right? Isn't it, or something? You know, things start to get these weird medical-sounding names. I mean, you've grown up with all of this; it's kind of normal. But I watched that moment of turning from this to this, and as a suburban person, brought up bored, shitless, in right near where George Michael's from. That's exactly where I'm from. And he killed himself. You know what his boyfriend said he died of? He just wore himself out. His body just gave out. And I know exactly what he means. We're the same age. And I grew up in that area, and it was so boring. All you could do is think of new ways to wear out your body, because there was nothing else, in a way. And I'm a product of the suburbs in the 70s. And I have a combination of delusion and distraction, right? So I didn't have a vision. Other people I went to college with were interested in sex or death. Other people were talented. Other people were even a genius. Some people couldn't help themselves. They just had to do doors all day. Other people had a political consciousness that was so more elevated than mine. And it wasn't until I read, which is always good, like Pierre Bourdieu or Lukács or Foucault, weirdly enough, more than anything, that I started to realize that there was something in this condition that I had, or this condition of origin, or this beginning point, right? And this could be the subject of the work, that I could move into, this sense of delusion and distraction could be the thing. It kind of half answers your question. I don't want to live in a world where people like me are the only people making work. This would be very, very bad. But I realized after 25 years there was something that I had seen, I think, that when I saw that tower on fire, I went really cold, because it's such a graphic representation of a misplaced gesture towards the triumph of aesthetics over a kind of reality, right? That is very, very complicated. And, hasn't been worked out. And you are the generation who needs to, in a sense, there's suddenly this big, in a sense, project to think about these relationships again without using the old terms, like the old men who would come up to me and say, well, this is not true. Like, what you're doing is a lie. It's decorative and designy. And somehow there's something in here. So the book is catastrophically self-absorbed at times and doesn't have many points of reference, or you can't verify it. But it's a polemic. It's got bits and pieces in it there's some lines in it that are good, I think. There's something in here, and I don't want to go on too long, but I'll give you a good reason why I did it. Okay, I'll tell you the truth, because I now have a beard and I'm a man. I tell you what happened. Okay, the reason why I really did it, because I don't do any studio teaching anymore, but I do keep in touch with a much more important group of people than artists, which is curators. So I go and I'm on the graduate committee at Bard College, which is one of the first curatorial studies programs in the world. So it's very good and very interesting. And all the people who go to it kind of hate each other, because it's a competitive environment and it's curating and it's very fraught. And I realized I don't really teach, but I realized that they asked me would I do a class, and I realized what they didn't do is they didn't do a class on contemporary art, which I thought was really funny for a curatorial program. There must have been examples of architecture schools where they didn't actually teach the history of architecture, of course, but yeah. But I thought this was kind of cool. So I thought I'd invite all the people I respected as new generation contemporary art historians to come to Bard to talk to us about the origins of contemporary art, like where it comes from. And the thing is, I didn't tell, most of them were too busy, but then I got a lot of money, so I could pay them really well. So I didn't tell them that I'd invited the other ones. So for 8 weeks, one week after the other, a fairly distinguished person like Alex Albero, or I don't know, a bunch of people came, really good people, and explained what the origins of contemporary art were. And what was really interesting is at least 5 of the 8 said the same thing. And I didn't actually know this was true. I didn't realize it. The origin of contemporary art is John Cage talking to the art historians, something in Pasadena, and someone talking somewhere in California in 1957 or something. I mean, John Cage, I was around when in the 80s and 70s. John Cage is absolutely, I never heard his name mentioned once until, I mean, he's an important figure, but this was never discussed. His name had never come up before. So this is a new, that I'm going to get argued with, but this is relatively new. The idea that John Cage is the origin, in a sense, of contemporary art. This is a kind of new one. So the students got really irritated, because it's a bit like if you're coming here and you waste your time 1 week, you have someone coming in and saying, well, you know, modern architecture starts with this, and then the next week another person comes and they sort of say the same thing. It was sort of irritating for people. So I asked the students if they could come up with a better term than contemporary art, because what's happening is these people are professors of contemporary art history, so they have to think about where it comes from. Otherwise, they're kind of stuck. So if we can think of another term, we can move ahead of them and save contemporary art and keep the amoeba growing and keep including more and more things in a kind of cynical way. Now, that's quite difficult and quite dangerous, so no one did anything. So none of the students came up with a better term. So I gave them all a C, because that was the only thing they had to do. And I got this call from Tom Eccles, who's the head of Bard College and the museum, saying, you can't give them a C. You can't do it. It's going to cause chaos. People are going to fail. And I said, okay. I said, this is the end of the talk, by the way. I said, okay, give them all an A. If they've got to go on a cross-country run, and then they can all get an A. And I just want to see one photograph of one person looking as if they could go on a cross-country run if they felt like it. And I never got that photograph, and I gave them all an A anyway. And that's the end of my story. That'll be in volume 2. Thank you. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you. We could, but I'm trying to stick to this.
Well, we'll do it after. No. We'll do it afterwards. Anyway, thank you all very much. I was hoping that we would engage more of you in a conversation, but maybe we can do it informally. Anyway, thank you so much, Liam. This was great. I know that this is an ongoing conversation, so we will continue to have this conversation. You have the mic ready, raring to go, but come and talk to Liam down here. Thank you again very much.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm bad.